Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir. And welcome to Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. This is one of my favorite Metroidvanias, and honestly, one of the most creative and unique Metroidvania games I've ever played, period. So I'm really looking forward to playing this, and I hope you'll enjoy watching. We're going to get started here in just a minute. We'll start with one of my go-to file names, Cinna. And I'm mostly going to let the game speak for itself in cutscenes, so I'll be quiet for a moment. Some very poetic imagery in the last paragraph there. So that is Graham Jones, who Soma asks if he comes from the church. He doesn't. But this early on in the game, he's actually quite nice to Soma, and you could think that he was one of the good guys. When he says, for instance, that a master is going to come to Dracula's castle and inherit all his powers, I'd better get going. You might think, oh, he's going to deal with it, like he's one of our friends. Actually, Graham Jones is the villain of this game, and the reason that he needs to get going is because he thinks he is this master who's going to come to the castle and take it over. This, of course, is going to lead some tension between him and Soma, because, as we've already seen, Soma has the ability to control the monsters of Dracula's castle. Which, you could argue, if he's Dracula, if Graham Jones is really Dracula, Soma's kind of stealing his bit. So yeah, this is the last time that Graham is going to be actually polite and friendly to us. When we meet him in the future, he's going to be more hostile. One nice thing about watching the gameplay of this, instead of being in the position of playing through it, is that you can see some of the background details that you don't notice while you're playing through the game the first time. This area has some cool backgrounds. I love the bookcases full of books. Maybe that's just my own prejudice. I also really like the student witches here as characters. They're walking around carrying a broom, but they're obviously not very good at flying. And then when you manage to defeat them, they turn into a little cat and run away. This might actually be the first game in which there were student witches. I know there were witch enemies in earlier games, but the student witch may have been an invention of this. But they're pretty funny in both this game and the sequel, Dawn of Sorrow. Oh, and a new character. So that's Yoko Belnades, a witch, and a descendant of Sipha Belnades, the sorceress from Castlevania 3. She's one of my favorite characters in the two Sorrow games. And interestingly, she's one of the first people to warn you against Graham and his intentions. She and Graham have kind of like a Ragnarok thing, where they're each other's mortal enemies, more so than Arikado and the other characters in the game, which is something I like. Ah, another cutscene. So Hammer is another character who I love. I'm particularly fond of the merchants in these Castlevania games. The one from Harmony of Dissonance is a pretty funny guy. And Hammer also has, quite a lot of personality to him. Just to fit the theme, this is one of the more Japanesey Castlevania games out there. Soma's a student who's learning in Japan, his girlfriend is Japanese. There's a lot more Japanese inspired monsters in this game. It's worth noting, though, despite that this game still has Ayami Kojima, who's famous for her work on Symphony of the Night, doing the character designs, and as a result, they're more Western-inspired and kind of watercolory. One of the interesting things about Castlevania is it's always been a more prominent franchise in the West than in Japan, kind of like Metroid. And so when Dawn of Sorrow came out and they got rid of Ayami Kojima, one of the things they mentioned is that people didn't like the art style very much, so they changed to a more mainstream anime-inspired kind of style. I think actually a big part of that was trying to get Japanese people to be more interested in these games, which had been so popular in the West, but not as popular as arguably they should have been in the East. So with that, we have now met all of the characters in the game. It happens kind of early, but yeah, from here on out, everything is just the characters we've already seen interacting with each other in various ways. I really like Jay. He's one of my favorite characters in the history of Castlevania. And he has amnesia, which, that's a bit trite, but the game deals with it in a pretty good way. It's not too tropey, the way they deal with Jay's amnesia. For one thing, it actually has a reason that would make some sense as a reason for someone to have amnesia. It's traumatic. Ugh. Speaking of traumatic, I just get completely beaten up by that Durga. This is, again, an example of one of the areas where you really do not want to have a fist-type weapon. Instead, much more useful will be the lance that I picked up just outside of this area. This place is called the Dance Hall, and it's one of the more unusual areas in the game. So it's basically a giant ballroom with some kind of crazy music. I've always liked this music, but it's not particularly tuneful. It's not the kind of thing you would listen to for fun. There's actually a couple of areas in Portrait of Ruin, which is 2 games after this, that may have been similarly inspired with the goofy music and the carnival-esque atmosphere because it's a dance hall. There's some really weird enemies in the dance hall part of this game. One of the things I like about Aria of Sorrow is that because the aesthetics are mostly very grounded and it looks like real parts of a castle, when you get to some of the weirder areas, there's a contrast that's very striking. So as I was saying earlier, one way in which this game is a lot like Symphony of the Night, but Harmony and Circle were not, is the combat system and the fact that you can use all these different types of weapons. Symphony of the Night, I would say, is more varied and diverse in that sense. For one thing, it has weapon combos that you can use. For instance, using the shield rod with various types of shields. That's way beyond what you're able to do in this game. And in fact, in general, it is kind of an unfortunate thing with Castlevania that there's some ways in which Symphony of the Night really has never been bettered. Symphony of the Night is almost a perfect Metroidvania. It's the game that really inspired the term in the first place. Since, Metroid existed for quite a while with the structure that it has, before anyone thought to call a game a Metroidvania. Oh, I really want that weapon, but I can't get to it yet because I can't slide. In any case, in some ways, really, Symphony of the Night was a really early peak for this series that it struggled to get back to. One of the things that I really appreciate about Order of Ecclesia, actually, is that it managed to go in a new direction and accomplish, a new type of perfection, I'd say, by mostly abandoning the attempt to just redo Symphony of the Night, but better. One of the things that I think most bothers people about Harmony of Dissonance as a game is just that it's so obviously indebted to Symphony of the Night. It's like it's ripping it off. Aria of Sorrow was good at getting away from that. Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin, I think, were a little compromised in that respect, although Portrait of Ruin has some things about it that are really funny and unique. But mostly aesthetic and, tone things. But then Order of Ecclesia was actually the first in gameplay terms to have a huge departure from what Metroidvania games had been, which is like a series of footnotes to Symphony of the Night. Oh, but here's something that I really like that's in this part. Right after you fight the big golem, you run into a room that contains this character, the Tsuchinoko. You also get the ability to slide, obviously. The Tsuchinoko is one example of how this game is more Japanese than a lot of other Metroidvanias. It is a Japanese cryptozoological creature that's like a snake with a little fat body. And in fact, in actual depictions of what this thing's supposed to look like, according to the myth, it looks even more like a snake. This thing has kind of a weird face. But the ordinary one is just supposed to have a snake head. So the thing about this Tsuchinoko, and it's kind of odd that I keep running into it, is this thing only has a 20% chance of actually appearing on screen. It has an 80% chance of doing what you see here, which is it just burrows into the ground when you come in, and you don't actually have a chance to fight it. It also has a fair chance of starting to burrow into the ground once it takes some damage, so that you're not able to actually defeat it for a chance to get the soul. The other thing about this enemy is that even when you have a chance to fight and kill it, the chance of obtaining its soul is pretty rare. So this is actually one of the hardest souls to get in the game. The soul is actually called... Well, I should say, the soul is called Tsuchinoko, like with all enemies. But the ability is called VIP, and it lowers the prices of goods at Hammer's shop. So it really is an almost totally useless soul that you'd only get for bragging rights. But I was just playing around there a little bit, trying to get it. I have grinded in the past in order to get that. Not entirely proud of that, but... You know, there's kind of a Pokemon quality with this game, where you have all these souls and you want to collect every single one. Which I think is part of the lasting appeal of this game. That there is so much to it, and you can play the game for 100 hours and still feel like there's secrets to it that you haven't figured out. I'm continuously finding out fun, interesting things that happen in this game from various enemies and souls interacting. And, you know, I've probably completed this game 5 or 6 times before this. But you can just keep learning about it. It's a very detailed and rich game. In any case, we now have a great weapon, the Cutall, which is like a knife with other little knives coming out of it, kind of like a Swiss Army knife. And one of the nice things about this weapon is that even though it has a fairly low attack, it hits enemies twice for every time that you hit him. Which means actually it can carve enemies up real quick. The range is pretty bad, but it is slightly better than a fist-type weapon. I also like in general with knives that Soma, rather than leaving them out, just takes them out of his coat, sticks the enemy, and then puts it back in his coat. Very suave. Soma, I will say, is one of the cooler looking and acting of the Castlevania protagonists. A lot of the early ones, the Belmont clan, they're just like barbarians flinging whips around. But Soma has a lot of style, and that makes him cool. So actually, the next boss here is coming up very quickly. Almost as soon as we enter the living quarters, we're going to get to it. I don't know what is up with this room. It's very cool looking. It has that thunderstorm in the background, and then there's this one Persephone in there, who is really beating me up. You can get to see her attacks pretty well here. But I have forgotten what, if anything, there is about this room that's special. If there's anything, I can't really tell what it is. Let's just heal up and move on. So this, I would say, is the first boss in the game who really gets difficult. This isn't quite the wake-up call I was talking about earlier, but it can be challenging. This is the Headhunter. You'll notice lots of heads on the back wall, which is kind of a spooky image. But there are only 3 that you actually fight against. The Headhunter has the ability to change form depending on which head it's using. You may have noticed this one is a beautiful woman, like a countess or something like that. She just attacks you with a knife. She's the easiest of the 3. This next head is that of a wizard or sorcerer of some kind, an old man. And when Headhunter has it on, he flies around the room casting spells of various kinds. It is actually a pretty serious boss. Near the end of Order of Ecclesia is a little like this guy. But yeah, he basically has a flame spell, which summons those 2 little fiery heads that go back and forth. And then an electric spell that is probably the easiest to dodge of them. It's just 3 little thunderbolts that move vertically. The hardest thing I would say actually about this guy is not dodging his attacks, but rather just hitting him. He's a little quicker than he looks, deceptively quick. And of course he's always in the air, so a little difficult to get him in range for a decent attack. The tiny devil soul is helping me out a great deal here. But actually, this is not the hardest phase of the boss. The hardest phase is the final one, where he has a lizard head that turns him into this strange lizard-human hybrid, who crawls around on the wall, on the ceiling like Granton Asti from Castlevania 3. We get poisoned here, so I put on the anti-venom. Poison doesn't work in this game quite like it normally does in other games. In this game, it doesn't cause you to gradually lose health, but instead causes all of your stats to go down, so you do less damage and take more damage. Pretty nasty status effect, actually, worse than a typical poison. And like I said earlier, there's not a lot of anti-venoms in this game. So this boss can be a bit of a pain. He's never in position when he's on the ceiling for any kind of reasonable attack. You basically always have to put yourself out there in order to get him in range of an attack while he's on the ceiling. Meanwhile, while he's on the floor, he will lick you a great deal. And his attacks are surprisingly robust for a guy who's also this quick and hard to fight. The interesting thing about the Headhunter, of course, is that he's a three-phase fight at all, which you haven't had up to this point. In fact, I would say a single one of his phases is about as challenging as any of the fights have been up to this point. So he really does seem to come out of nowhere in terms of the level of challenge here. And when you kill him, all of the heads in the wall disappear. Not entirely sure why that happens, but I suppose he was a load-bearing boss. And you get... Okay, so I was a little off earlier. Graham doesn't immediately turn hostile the next time you meet him. He actually starts out being, polite again and nice. And it's only when Soma mentions that he has the power to rule, which is something Yoko told him, that Graham starts to turn nasty and evil. Graham is actually one of my favorite villains in any Castlevania game because there's a fair amount of complexity to him. He's not a particularly cruel man. It's more like he's arrogant. He thinks of himself as the one destined to inherit Dracula's powers, and he's not willing to let anyone stand in the way of that. But it is funny, one of the things he says in that little cutscene is that the reason he was polite to Soma, which Soma thought meant he was his friend, was actually just because Graham doesn't consider him a threat. And so he's basically being magnanimous, like, welcome to my castle, I'm Dracula. And Graham really does think that he is Dracula. By being born on the same day that Dracula died, Graham felt that he inherited his soul. We'll later find out that's not necessarily true. The soul doesn't quite work that way, but... Either way, it does seem that multiple characters could inherit Dracula's powers, depending on what happens. I love that little clip of Yoko saying, hello, right when she sees Soma here. The Game Boy Advance was fairly primitive in terms of its capabilities, both audio and graphics related. But I think they did some pretty clever things with stuff like voice clips in this. So here's the bomb.
Yo, man, you think these people are working or what? I don't know, man. Just play it to them, man. What's the matter? What I want to know is if you're educated.
Little pause to collect myself, and here we go. So, as is fairly typical for a Castlevania game, in the Clock Tower, you fight death. This is not just a wake-up call of a boss. This is an incredibly difficult boss that I would say is harder than every other boss in the entire game, including the final boss. Not obviously in terms of strict numbers, but just in terms of your capabilities of fighting him at the time when you have to. There's lots of different things that make this boss fight annoying. One is the constant spawning of these little scythes, which is a fairly typical thing in Castlevania. But in a game that's mostly been easy so far, to have this kind of mechanic that's more familiar from the pre-Metroidvania Castlevanias, it can be very distracting. And another thing about these things is that they do actually do a fair amount of damage. But worse than that, they have a tendency to knock you into the swipes of the big scythe, which means that you get damaged twice at once and also get thrown around. So it's difficult to keep your positioning. The other thing about the scythes is even if they don't hit you, they will force you to move around constantly, which means they're constantly knocking you out of a good position to strike the scythe. Death in this first phase, and yes, this is a two-phase battle because it wasn't hard enough, also has multiple different attacks. In addition to summoning the little scythes and sending out the big one to swipe at you, he'll also throw his hands in the air, which will cause a bunch of beams of energy to fly out of the ground and attack you. These things are not too difficult to run away from. However, one thing that's a little annoying is there's a big delay between when he starts the attack and when they start moving, which means if the little scythes which keep spawning force you to one wall or the other, you actually won't be able to move far enough away once the attack starts in order to get past all of them. You can see here how I'm constantly running myself out of room by moving too quickly when that attack starts, by trying to run away from it. So, when you finally destroy the original scythe, his second phase begins, when his body itself becomes tangible. and he brings out a new, much more elaborate scythe. This phase, if anything, is more annoying than the first one. I'm trying to avoid his hitbox here by just using bullet souls, but it doesn't work. Yeah. So I die here. And yeah, like I mentioned earlier, this game over screen we see here is actually the same image as a painting that we saw in the dance hall. It also is, frankly, just shocking how much health Death has. Like, he can take way more hits than any other enemy in this game. Including, I should say, so far. But including not only all the bosses we've fought so far, but several bosses that you fight after this guy. It's just very confusing. On top of all that, he has 2 phases. I mean, this boss is just a real meat grinder. But finally I managed to get through it, after a lot of heartache. And, in defense of this boss fight, after you beat Death, you get his soul, which allows you to summon those little scythes to attack your enemies, which is pretty cool. You also get one of the, Metroidvania power-up souls, Skula, which is, again, a mistranslation of a Scylla, like Scylla in Charybdis. And this allows us to go underwater, which opens up the underground reservoir and a very large portion of the game from there. And I had this slight suspicion that there was something going on with that wall on the left hand. It's one of these instincts you sort of get after a while when you've played enough Metroidvanias. People often say, for instance, that in Metroid you have to bomb every wall in order to find the secrets. I don't think that's true. Or you have to, bomb every square inch of floor. That's really not true. There's clues. And if you play the games long enough, you'll realize what those clues are. So here we get a new weapon, the Mystletain, which is a pretty cool weapon. I like it a lot. It's also got a cool name. Mystletain is the old name for mistletoe. And actually, something I learned from the Yogscast, Mystletain literally means little dung twig, because it would grow in dung. At least that's what they believed, the ancient druids. Familiar if you've, read Asterix books. I, of course, am so cool that I read the Asterix books as an adult. But, we can't all be that cool. So I don't normally talk over these, but this is an optional cutscene, so I'll just say this here. When you talk to Mina, she says "Okaeri," which is Japanese for "welcome back." Literally, it's "kaeru" is to come. And then when you leave, she says "kiwotsukete ne," which literally means something like keep your senses awake or energized. But figuratively, it means take care of yourself or just take care. Now, here's a very curious enemy, one I actually like a lot. The Maneater, which is a bunch of eyeball worms hiding inside the skull of some other giant creature, which you never actually get to see what that creature was like in any Castlevania game. Nice little bit of mystery. Instead, you only get to see the creature that's taken it over like a hermit crab. And the Maneater is genuinely spooky. It's one of the enemies in this game that I actually find kind of gruesome. Which, it's supposed to be scary. That's sort of the point, right? The Maneater was also adapted to become a boss in Order of Ecclesia. In that game, they made him look a little more gory, but honestly, it's not any scarier. I think it's about equally scary. We also get here the Rahab's sword, which I love. Rahab later became a boss in Dawn of Sorrow, which is the sequel to this game. But Rahab's sword is basically just an ice elemental sword. I think the only one in the game that has that element. There's several swords in Symphony of the Night that have an ice element, but only this one in Aria of Sorrow, I believe, has it. I should also mention here a new enemy, the Kanyatzos, who I like a lot. They are based on one of the characters of the Malabranche, or Wicked Tales, which are demons from one of the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. I had a video about my favorite Castlevania enemies once where I talked about the various creatures of the Malabranche. There are 13 of them mentioned in the Inferno, but only 6 of them ended up in Castlevania games. 3 in this game and then 3 in its sequel. One of the things I really like about both Aria and Dawn is how erudite they are. There's lots of references to demonology and classic Greek myth and things like that. Which is not to say those things don't exist in other Castlevania games, because they do. But these games go crazy with them. And so it's something I just love. It reminds me of a TV show I watched when I was a kid called The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, which was a really goofy show about 2 kids who force the Grim Reaper to be their best friend, which, of course, as a Castlevania fan, You have to love the Grim Reaper or death in anything. But it also had all of these ridiculous, just literary and cultural references that were way too sophisticated for a show that was that silly. There's a whole episode where Billy is possessed by the spirit of the poet Lord Byron, and there are actual quotes from Lord Byron poems in the episode. And I just love that combination of high and low culture. It's actually one of my favorite things to find ways that people manage to sneak culture and edification into, silly kids' stories. So, the secret area, normally you would go around to the right and that would take you to the end. However, there is in fact a secret area inside the secret area, which not everyone will find, but it's right through this fake wall. So in here is a very interesting and unusual weapon. So you can see there, it's something like Climb Solace. In fact, that is not the name, or the way you pronounce that word. This name literally means Sword of Light, and it's basically a plot device that appears in a lot of Irish myth. It's a Celtic word, and like a lot of Celtic words, it has a very strange pronunciation. The word that is spelled C-L-A-I-M-H is actually pronounced cleave. Kind of like a sword cleaving things, which is kind of funny. So the name of it is Cleave Solace. Not Climb Solace, which is what it looks like, or Claim Solace. That's what I've heard a lot of people calling it. I'm going to be calling it the Climb Solace, because that just, it sounds right to me. But yeah, the technical way you pronounce it is Cleave Solace. There's lots of weird words like that in Gaelic, especially in Irish myth. So for instance, there is a figure in Irish legend he was a king. His name is spelled C-O-N-C-H-O-B-A-R. That's his first name, and his last name is MacNessa, which means son of Nessa. There's a lot of matrilineal surnames in Irish myth. So his name looks like it should be pronounced Conchabar. It's actually pronounced Con-Akar. Con-Akar MacNessa. And really, the wonder of pronunciation is you can pronounce that word any way you want to. No one can take that away from you. And here it is. One of my favorite fights in any Castlevania game, Legion. Also known as Grand Falloon in Symphony of the Night. Now, I do have to say, while I'm always a big fan of Legion, and I do like his appearance in this game, as well as the giant tub of orange sherbet that is floating around in the background, which is kind of cool. This is actually one of my least favorite Legion fights because of the way the arena is designed and how it forces you to move. So a typical Legion fight will have him floating in midair, and then you have to jump up in order to reach all his different segments and fight him. And it's pretty tense. You also often get trapped on the ground where all of his little homunculus bodies have accumulated, and you have to hit them in order to get rid of them, or else they'll mob you, and that can be very dangerous. The problem that I have with this particular fight is that unlike almost every other Legion fight in the series, in this, he doesn't take up most of the middle of the room and then you have to jump around him. Instead, he's much smaller, and you basically get chased by him around this arena. Part of the problem that I have with that is that it means it keeps you away from the floor for most of it, which means you don't have to worry about his little homunculus guys. That takes away a huge portion of the challenge of this fight, and basically means that you're just being chased by a giant slow ball, which is not intimidating. It gets rid of a lot of the scary factor of this boss, and I think the fact that this boss is creepy is one of the, biggest assets about it. The arena, as we're going to soon see, kicks my butt about as effectively as Death did. It does everything short of actually kill me, which Death managed to do, so, I guess he wins. But he's dead now, and he's Death and he's dead. Quite an irony. So who's the real winner? I also like the interesting fact that I now have 666 max HP. So this is a good time. So a new enemy, one of the Malabranche, in here. We have who gives you the Poison Fist, which is kind of a cool fist-type weapon. I like it. Gonna try it out a little bit here. The Beam Skeletons are the worst possible enemies in the game to try it on, so I don't know what the heck I'm doing. But you may have noticed this enemy that gave us the Poison Fist is called Skull Milione. Now that is a mistranslation and a very bad one, to be honest. The character's name is Scarmiglione, which involves that GL sounding like la thing that so many people have trouble with in Italian, like familia or battaglia. But, yeah, his name is Scarmiglione, which is spelled S-C-A-R-M-I-G-L-I-O-N-E. In Japanese, that would be rendered as Scarumirione. And presumably, when they saw Skaru, they assumed that was skull, which I guess is a reasonable enough mistake to make. But have these people seriously never heard of Scarmiglione? And if they have, why were they allowed to translate a Castlevania game? I mean, that's just shameful. So yeah, instead we get Skullmiglione, which ranks up there with Curly as one of the stupider enemy names in this game. They got Cagnazzo correct. I mean, how could they get that right? That even has the GN thing, which people have just as much trouble with as the GL thing. Oh, I also like that you can get ramen by killing the killer mantles. This really is just kind of a silly but fun and also kind of scary area. A scaria, if you will. I like the red Minotaurs. Fighting Minotaurs is pretty fun, and since at this point in the game the regular Minotaurs would be too easy, you have the red ones, which are more difficult. We also get here Laevateinn, which is probably my favorite sword in the entire game. It is not as overpowered as the Cleave Sullus, but it's so much more fun to use, because the Cleave Sullus just sweeps across the whole screen. You're not showing any flair when you fight with it, you're really just cheesing everybody. With Laevateinn, it's got a nice big spread, and it's, you know, the thrusting type sword, which is one of my favorites. But also, it's just got a cool appearance, it has the fire element, which, you know, maybe it's because I'm an Aries, but I love that. And also, the fact that it's called Laevateinn always reminds me of that one scene from Lucky Star, where Konada finds a rare drop of a sword called Laevateinn in her online game, and it causes her to stay up playing until 3 in the morning, and then when she gets to school the next day she has to make an excuse about being sick. Yes, I am one of those people, I do like Lucky Star. When I was really young, you know, when Lucky Star was new, I thought it was the stupidest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Then I became an adult, life got more stressful, and I realized Lucky Star is actually a very fun and laid-back anime. Though God help you if you want to read the manga. That manga is impossible to find in English. So we are actually approaching the end of the arena here. But not the end of the gauntlet, because what we're seeing here in these last few areas, last few rooms we're going to see, is some of the toughest challenge in the entire game. There's 3 levels here, and here's the first one. It is a room just absolutely full of another mistranslation. This character's name in the Inferno was Rubicante, and they translated it as Lubicant. I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But yeah, they just completely beat me up, these guys. This was one of the more frustrating segments of the game. One of the things that's very difficult here, and frustrating, is that in addition to being mauled by those guys, and look at how they tore me to pieces. Holy crap, I feel like the Scarecrow after the monkeys shook all of the hay out of him. In addition to having to fight all these enemies at once, if you're not being careful, those statues in the background that are pushing forward with their feet and hands, those actually do cause damage. So they will punch you into the Rubicantes, excuse me, and then the Rubicantes will push you back into the fists, and it's really just a mess. Speaking of messes, this room is almost as bad. It is full of Medusa heads that will petrify you and put you into the spikes, where, of course, if you remain petrified once they do damage, they'll do double. It's also full of these conveyor belts, and just to add insult to injury, here's an Archdemon. You weren't having enough trouble before. Deal with this shit. And stupidly, I walk right into a trap that is probably one of the easiest traps in the game to avoid, and yet it still gets me. But your reward for this is the Balmont, which is a pretty good sword. It has a nice wide sweep, covers a lot of the room. The only real problem with it is it has no elemental advantage. And then, of course, the other problem with it is that I am not good at this game, and so it doesn't change that, so it doesn't make me better at the game, and really, that being the case, what's the point of it? Finally, kicking does something for me, and using the Nightmare as well. So here we get the Beam Skeleton Soul. Not a bad soul, but it does take up a lot of MP. So be careful when you use it. It also doesn't last as long when you use it as they do, I guess because you're not as good at it. You know, leave this to the professionals, the professional beamers. Scotties, you might call them. Did I mention earlier that this was the episode for stupid references? Because it totally is. So this next boss, we finally going to get the ability to fly, because we'll get the giant bat soul, which is really cool. I love this enemy. He appears in Dawn of Sorrow as well. And did you think I was talking about the bat when I said that? Because I wasn't. I was talking about this guy, Balore. I love this boss. The fact that you think you're going to fight the giant bat, and then he just comes in from the background and squishes it. It's fantastic. I do end up switching back to the Laevateinn, by the way, because fire is fine against this guy. But yeah, I absolutely love this boss. He's named after an ancient Irish Gaelic mythical king of the monsters, basically. And yeah, he has this one baleful eye, which, in the original Druidic myth, that eye would kill you if you looked at it. Here, all it can do is cause explosions, which isn't nearly as interesting, but, you know, still kind of cool. He also appears in Dawn of Sorrow. I have to say, I like his appearance a lot less in that game, even though arguably it's truer to the original appearance. It's more ghoulish. He looks less like just a big guy with a beard. But I love this incarnation of Balore. This is my favorite one. In particular, I want to go to the underground waterway. Punch some dryads, and we'll be getting a couple cool weapons here. I love, by the way, the fact that the Poison Fist is surprisingly effective against a poison worm. You would think it would have a resistance to poison. Apparently this game doesn't follow Pokemon rules. So yeah, you might remember this room. This is where we encountered the secret area. But in addition, this is actually a really tall room, so this is a great place to test out the giant bat soul. And in this room we find Longinus's Spear. It should be obvious to people who are familiar with this game's particular brand of mistranslation that this is actually Longinus's Spear, which is to say the Lance of Longinus, the weapon that legendarily a Roman soldier used to cut Jesus' side after he was crucified to make sure that he was dead. Which is said to be cursed or maybe blessed, like as a relic because of that. A very strange myth. We also pick up the handgun, one of the more fun weapons to use in this game, but not a particularly good one, I have to say. The really good thing about it, obviously, is its range. It can hit an enemy from across the room. It also has a pretty good rate of fire, but the damage you do with it is piddling. So its only real use is to do funny things like going completely gangster execution style on this flesh golem. And Soma is really just so stylish, pulling that gun out and then tucking it back in with every single time he shoots the gun. You see, Soma can't just leave the gun out and fire it. That would be too plebeian and pedestrian. Soma's a gentleman, and he fights accordingly. I also love how, choosing to kill the golem with this gun, which is just a total waste of time, I get its soul, as if the game is rewarding me for my pointless stylishness. I'm also going to show here how quickly he goes down if we just use one of the better weapons. So you'll see, Longinus' Spear does really good damage. It's one of my favorite weapons in the game, and definitely one of the most powerful in terms of just sheer attack strength. I don't think it has an elemental bonus, though, so that's something to consider. So another thing that we can do now, not because of the giant bat soul, but because we got the Galamoth soul in the catacombs, or whatever they're called in this game, I forget, is we can go back to the place where time was stopped before. And take on the Chrono Mage, which you might notice is a rabbit with a clock. Clearly an Alice in Wonderland reference. Also, maybe a JoJo reference. There's a slight possibility, since it's an enemy that stops time and then pushes you back to the beginning of the room where you found it. Those of you who are JoJo watchers probably know what I'm referring to. But I'm not sure if Konami is. I know that there are some things in Castlevania that are definitely JoJo references. A Zephyr from Dawn of Sorrow is definitely one. There's no other way they would have thought of that character. But there's others where it's a little more difficult to tell. The stone mask that appears in Symphony of the Night and later games, for instance, is one of those. So up here in the place that we find past the Chrono Mage, we find the Dane's Lef, which is a pretty good sword, although it's of the type that I don't like, the overhead swinger. And we also get the second ancient book, which tells us that the second spirit is the King of Bats. Now, this should definitely be a clue to what this is getting at, because we currently have the giant bat soul equipped. That's what it means, like almost certainly. So clearly, the first one was red. That would correspond to an attack-type soul. And it said, you know, we needed to equip the Demon of Flames, which is probably the Flame Demon Soul, which we already have. We now have another one that says that the blue soul, which we need to have equipped, is the King of Bats. Well, we already have that. So the real question is, what is this mysterious third soul? And is there a third book that will tell us? Only time will tell, because I am not. To get past them without fighting them. Oh, I love this. So we've seen one succubus before, again in the arena, but here they're all over the place, along with powered-up versions of the Valkyrie called Erinyes, which is the Greek name for the for the Furies. And then more red minotaurs, which we also saw in the arena. One thing I really like about the Succubi here is when they're pretending to be Mina and appealing to Soma, they say, Taskate, which means help me. As if Soma's going to be tricked by that after the first time. You'd think eventually they'd stop bothering. You know, at a certain point he's going to think, yeah, I know where Mina is, she's not here. We all know the score. But hope springs eternal even among demons, I suppose. They're always assuming they can trick Soma. Funnily enough, in Dawn of Sorrow, which is the sequel to this game, they appear to him not as his girlfriend, but as Yoko, who's just a hot woman that he happens to know. Kind of suggesting that maybe Soma's not the world's best boyfriend, or that he's easily tempted. It's hard to say. But more interesting, underneath here we have the Iron Golem, who you might have noticed I just did 1 damage to. Let's talk about this Iron Golem for a second. So he has 9,999 HP, 1 MP, because he doesn't cast any spells, an attack of 70, and literally the highest possible defense in the game. It's 255. He also has a tolerance to every known element, weaknesses to nothing, and is totally unaffected by stopping time. So you would think that this guy definitely is almost impossible to defeat. You do 1 damage per hit, and you need to hit him 9,999 times. So, how are we going to defeat this menace? Well, you'll soon see. What we're going to do is... I think I left this on for a little too long, sorry. Okay, what we're going to do is use the Killer Mantle Soul, which we collected in the arena, and which I mentioned would come in handy. This is where it comes in handy. You might remember that the Killer Mantle allows you to swap the HP and MP of enemies, which means we do almost 9,999 HP of damage to him in a single stroke. I love this game, it's absolutely crazy. And your reward for being this crazy is the Hippogriff Soul, which I also think is fantastic. You use it to do what is called the gravity jump in Symphony of the Night, and has been in Metroidvanias almost ever since. It's just this soaring jump which takes you all the way through the air. And one of the things I love about it is, if you do it with a ceiling above Soma's head, he will crash right into it with his skull, and make a sickening cracking noise that definitely tells you that Soma's going to be missing a few vertebrae by the end of this game. It's so quirky, I love it. The gravity jump in Symphony of the Night, I believe you just sort of crumble against the ceiling if you use it. It doesn't have that weird, like, skull-crushing maneuver that you see here. And then, of course, in Harmony of Dissonance, oddly enough, Juiced will not crush his head against the ceiling. He'll instead sort of turn upside down and he'll touch the ceiling with his feet, which is a very unusual version of that. Oh, thanks. Good. Go ahead and do that. Oh. I mean... Oh, great. He's going full Anton Chigurh on us. I love that line. You are one selfish bastard. Bit of an anticlimactic ending. But, you know, not every game has to have a super happy ending or a super dramatic ending. Sometimes it just ends mysteriously. This has been a mysterious game, so I think that's appropriate. You might think these are joke credits like the end of the original Castlevania, with the system being attributed to Curry the Kid, but that is the That is the person's actual nickname, and that's how he decided to be credited in the credits. Or she, I don't know. Kind of like how Koji Igarashi is always called Iga, which sounds like a noise you make when someone steps on your foot, but he likes it. Enemy designed by Asaka. Thank you very much. Map designed by Tsuguro. I have no idea what that means. And of course the scenario, which means the story, by Iga. And of course this was the last game to have Ayami Kojima as the lead character designer. A little bit wistful, I have to say. She was an amazing illustrator. The series really didn't have anything close to matching her until the new guy whose name I forget took over in Order of Ecclesia, which had absolutely brilliant art. I mean, definitely a match for her, if not better. But either way, they stand at about the same level of quality. I love this game's art. In fact, I love just about everything about this game. So I'm really pleased that you could be here with me to see it to the end. And yes, let's give some special thanks to Great Matsu Fuji. Matsu, I believe, means pine, and Fuji means Mount Fuji, so Matsu Fuji. And most thanks to you, because apparently PBS produced this game. Well, that's the end, everybody. and I'll be seeing you guys with the next game. So, once again, this has been Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video. Now, you might be surprised that we're here again, if you didn't watch the last video all the way to the end, or if you're just not particularly quick on the uptake. Because, of course, you should have noticed that at the end of that last video, the castle didn't crumble to bits. It was still there, which is ridiculous. Yes, a Castlevania game can end on a mysterious note. Yes, it can end without being totally satisfying. But the castle always has to be destroyed and then come back when Dracula is defeated. Oh, sorry, when Dracula is revived the next time. So no, we actually got the bad ending there. You may have noticed we totally forgot about the third book, which I didn't actually manage to find in this playthrough. But the third book tells you that you have to equip the Succubus soul. It doesn't tell you in so many words, it's more of a roundabout thing. But it does basically tell you that. And in fact, if we don't have that soul equipped, we will not get the true ending. What we just saw was sort of the bad ending, or at least the incomplete ending. So Soma has an interesting personality. He has been sort of possessed by the evil spirit of this castle, but being a strong personality, he didn't inherit Dracula's personal strength. Oh, I just wanted to do a little pose here. I think it's kind of cool with Arakato standing like that. Soma has the ability to basically fight off the darkness that's inside him, and that's what he's trying to do right now. The more time goes by, the more he will be taken over by that dark power. But if he can stop it now, before it's advanced too far, kind of like a sickness, he can sort of cut it out of himself. So I'm switching my souls back here, now that I don't need them for the fight. And one really cool thing that you get at this point in the game, which I have to say is one of the biggest things you deprive yourself of if you don't do the secret ending, is you get the Black Panther soul, which is fantastic. It lets you move at the speed of light across this map. Really, lots of fun. You also do damage as you move, kind of like the screw attack in Metroid. So it's a great way to get around quickly. So there's only one thing standing in the way of us getting to the heart of the chaos, and that is this kicker skeleton, which we kill in 2 hits. So now there's nothing. Hooray. Let's go. This is a pretty cool room. You can see the bottom of the castle floating beneath you. Oh. Yeah, this is awkward. Okay then. Nice to see you too, Julius. No, seriously though, so, there is one thing that can stop us from getting to the heart of the chaos, and it is Julius Belmont, who sees it as his bounden duty to destroy Dracula, which we now are. Something he mentioned suspecting when he saw us back in the arena, but now has been totally confirmed for him. I absolutely adore this fight. It is possibly my favorite boss fight in the entire Castlevania series. No matter how good you are at this game, not that I'm saying I am, but he is basically a match for you. Like, it's a really even match, where he has this whip, which realistically has a longer range than most of the weapons you can summon against him. I guess you could use the handgun against him, but that would be a little bit, how to put it, gauche. It wouldn't be gentlemanly. But yeah, trading hits with this guy is not a great idea. You may have noticed even with the Ever Sing-On, which is the best armor in the game, he still does more damage per hit to me than I do to him. Which is sort of a reflection of how the Vampire Killer whip is meant to kill Dracula. And so it's absolutely deadly to us. Oof, I came really close to dying there. Don't worry, dying against death was the only real death that I left in this game. Or did I? No, seriously though. So Julius, like I said, just a great fight, and it is a long fight. He has a lot of HP, and lots of different tactics. So when you get him down to about half HP, he does the Grand Cross, which you've definitely got to make sure you're far enough away from him before he starts doing it, because after a certain point, you are unable to get farther away. Basically, you can just delay your being sucked into the middle. So if you're already within range of the attack by that point, you're going to be hit by it, and you're probably dead. In the second stage of the attack, Julius starts using all of the traditional tools of the trade to fight Dracula. Not only his whip, but also the holy water, the cross, axes, and lots of other cool stuff. It really is cool to be on the receiving end of these tools, which had been so useful to the player throughout most of the other Castlevania games. And he's just using them against you. But Soma shuts the shit down. He's had enough. And he says something kind of funny here, which is, he knows Julius wasn't really trying to kill him. And it does make sense. With the Vampire Killer, Julius could totally kill Soma if he intended to, even considering how strong Soma is. And so Soma asks him for a very unique favor, which is, if this doesn't work out, kill me so I don't hurt more innocent people. And Julius, because he is the most badass person ever, says, yep, I'll do it. I will take your ass out of this world. They actually do have a fantastic friendship, Julius and Soma. It's a shame that Dawn of Sorrow doesn't go into that more. But the relationship between these two characters is really cool. I love the sort of triangle scenario of Julius being concerned about Soma and wanting to stop Graham. Graham being jealous of Soma and not really understanding Julius at all. And then Soma, who has these friends who he has to balance caring about them with the fact that he is Dracula. Okay. So we're heading to the final area of the game, which is pretty tough. And so, for the first time, I actually am going to start using the Cleave Celis. I think I'm totally justified in being a chicken in this part because it's nothing all that exceptional in terms of, like, fight mechanics. So it's not like I'm depriving myself of a chance to have some unique fights. Here in the Chaotic Realm, which does have some really cool, trippy graphics. This reminds me of Blue Oyster Cult album covers. I love this. Now, this... Oh, and here comes the anime. I actually really love this plot point. Everyone is rooting for Soma, and they're lending him their power, like Goku with the Spirit Bomb. And they're not even afraid of him. Mostly because I think they're all convinced they can kick his ass if they really need to. Yes, even Mina. Ah, Julius. A true bro to the end. And here we go. So this is the source of Dracula's power. Yep, it's modern architect. Sorry, modern skull. And then the final thing that it does against you is it has this bone dragon, which is constantly swooping around. Probably the weirdest aspect of this boss fight, and the one that makes the least sense symbolically. I have no idea what metaphorically the bone dragon is supposed to represent. I'm sure Freud could come up with a few ideas. It's a little hard to know what to focus on in this fight, and I think that's part of the idea, is that this fight is meant to overwhelm you. This is, after all, a final boss that is called Chaos. And it's not like the one from Sonic Adventure, I'll tell you that much. The Bone Dragon is actually surprisingly easy to not get hit by. I was surprised by that. Now we've done it, and Dracula's power splinters and breaks into little bitty pieces. And guess what's going to happen to the castle as a result of that? Yes, it's going to break into little bitty pieces. This is a proper Castlevania ending. This is what I'm talking about. It is not a Castlevania until the castle breaks. And Soma dies? He doesn't actually die, but this kind of looks like he's going to heaven, doesn't it? God, did everybody know I was Dracula besides me? Really? Yeah, ha ha ha, Yoko. Thanks a lot. You were unconscious for half of this game. And she friend zones us right at the end. You're like a younger brother to me. Oh, maybe this is what causes Soma to see Succubi that look like her in the next game. Hammer tells us that he's quitting the army and opening up a shop, which is funny because he already told us he was going to do that before. And the vampire killer doesn't work anymore, because it always stops working when Dracula's defeated. So, I guess Julius Belmont's out of a job. And Aricado gets really philosophical on us here. Like, Jesus Christ. What do you think you are, Thomas Aquinas? I love that little ending sentence in my mother's name. For those of you who don't know, Alucard's mother was actually a human woman, which is part of the reason why he doesn't follow in Dracula's dark footsteps. And why he protects human beings against Dracula, and this is part of the reason he became Arikado in the first place. Because the Japanese are particularly susceptible to Dracula or something, I don't know. He needed to become Japanese because Koji Igarashi is Japanese. Oh, Soma, you're being so sappy. Now we know you've purged Dracula from your soul, because he would never be this freaking cheesy. Yep, and so he says if something bad ever happens, everyone else will rush to his aid, which they do in the next game, Dawn of Sorrow. Hard to say. I will say, though, that seeing this, now we're actually surrounded by the other people in the cast, which is like my favorite cast in Castlevania. I love this game. So now, finally, having seen the good ending, having put to rest Dracula's dark power once and for all, until he comes back the next time, we are finally done with Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next game.